For all the world, there was order, a mandate for the proper way things should be, a place and a time for each thing, for the days to grow longer and for the days to grow shorter, for the yang to be ascendant and then the yin, for the moon to wax and then to wane, to plant and to harvest. As heaven declared it to be, structure was created and stability was the result. Even change itself was regulated, so that as one thing flowed into another, it was to happen in a predictable way. This was no accident. The mandate of heaven applied to all things equally, from the lodges of the night sky to the people of the middle kingdom, and all things participated in it, each part with its place and role. The sky reflected the essence of heaven in its perfect regularity, the emperor in the proper observance of the ceremonies and rituals, and the people in following the direction of the emperor and performing the tasks of daily life at the proper times. As impersonal as the mandate was, not respecting of person or position, there was always a place for humanity. Through the emperor, all the civilized people of the empire played a sacred role in ensuring that the ongoing flux continued as prescribed, so that the chaos that always threatened at the edges was held at bay and pushed further and further back from the boundaries. In observance of the rituals dating back to the 3 kings and the 5 emperors, the people, led by one upon whom the mandate rested, assured that the cycles of the universe would continue uninterrupted. And so, as the shortest day of the year approached, the emperor and his retinue moved into the hall of fasting, and for 3 days abstained from the worldly pleasures of wine, women, and rich food and clothes. On the winter solstice, before the sun rose above the horizon, the humble supplicant for the people left his place in the temple of heaven and walked north towards the round mound. As he approached, he saw that thousands had gathered to witness his sacrifice. Among them were banners representing all aspects of the universe, 28 for the lunar lodges, 12 for the houses of Jupiter, 5 each for the wanderers, the towering peaks, the elements and parts of the world, 4 for the encompassing rivers. It was the universe in pageant. Alone, the earthly emperor ascended the stairs from the south, looking up to the pole star, the symbol of Shang, the great celestial ruler, the supernal lord. Just as the people of the Middle Kingdom usually faced north towards him when he offered the sacrifices at the beginning of spring, the emperor now faced north towards a power greater than himself. Through 3 terraces he traveled, each one round and higher than the next. The first was for the earth, the second for the empire, but the third, where only the dynastic ruler could go, was the altar of heaven. Once there, an account of the doings of the past year was given, read aloud before the sky. Prostrations were made, then gifts were offered and libations poured. Then the hand from a sacrificed slave was burned on the mound, the smoke rising as an offering for peace and prosperity in the coming year. Finally, after the final rites, the emperor descended back down to the terrace of the empire, where the rest of the sacrifice was offered in pyre. In this ritual was the yang energy of the universe stimulated, strengthened to balance the ascendant yin energy of the season. Only the truly foolish and wasteful emperor would neglect these sacred responsibilities. Only a weak and unfit man would risk losing the mandate of heaven, and so, in 6 months, on the summer solstice, a similar ceremony would be repeated on the north side of the city at the altar of the earth, where the victims of sacrifice were buried in the earth as a work to activate the yin to balance the now stronger yang. It was the proper order, and each emperor knew his role in maintaining it as was mandated. When the last emperor of the Shah had shown himself so degenerate as to forego these rituals, heaven had shown the lord of the Shang that he now had the mandate and must assume kingship. The same had happened with the Duke of Zhou some 500 years later. With the mandate came the right to rule and the obligation to participate in the ongoing cycles of heaven.
Hello, and welcome
to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 3.1, Supplemental. Ancient Chinese Astronomy and the Mandate of Heaven. In this episode, our second in a series on the ancient astronomical traditions, we'll look at the development of cosmological models and the astronomy done to maintain them in the early Chinese dynastic period. In this effort, I am immeasurably aided by a fairly recent book, Astrology and Cosmology in Early China, by sinologist and archaeoastronomer Dr. David Pankinier of Lehigh University. This book is a deep look at the ancient roots of the cosmological and astronomical basis for the lasting political structure of one of humanity's oldest and grandest civilizations. A word of advice here, though. While the book is excellent, it requires some initial familiarity with Chinese history and culture. Additionally, it is fairly academic in its approach, getting into the scholarly details of the work. Those seeking something that might require a little less preparation would be well served to work through the book by Krupp I mentioned in the podcast on Egyptian astronomy, Echoes of Ancient Skies. Additionally, for those interested in a podcast overview of the history of China, I would highly recommend either the podcast History of Our World for the 10,000-foot view, specifically episodes 56 through 63, or for those looking for a good bit more detail, I heartily recommend the History of China podcast. Chris Stewart does a really great job with this look of China from its earliest historical roots. As was the case with Egypt, it is important from the outset to understand the framework into which the astronomy and cosmology fit. Whereas in Egypt, the fundamental concerns centered around the cyclical nature of life and the concerns with the proper death and resurrection that resulted from this, the most profoundly driving force in the astronomy and cosmology of the culture of China was creating and maintaining order. Where the Egyptians saw cyclicality, the Chinese saw permanence and structure. Where the Egyptians created passion narratives that put them into the skies, the Chinese saw a heaven that came down to them to construct an orderly and fundamentally conservative society. These differences can be most easily seen in the cosmological system of both cultures. While both cultures were familiar with all of the naked eye observations we've been discussing in the main narrative of the series, each focused on and emphasized different things. The Chinese structured their cosmos around the unchanging parts of a celestial model, the North Pole and the celestial equator. The pole never moved, and the equator, while it turned, was always to be found across the same portion of the sky. Things such as the sun, the moon, and the planets might move in reference to these points in their paths through the heavens, but the points themselves were rock solid, and to them were anchored the stars. The Egyptians, on the other hand, focused their observational energy on the cycles of change encompassed by these very same things. It was the ecliptic with its zodiacal markers and monthly and yearly paths of the sun and moon through them that became the touchstone of their religious experience and thus their worldview. It would be this emphasis that would profoundly affect the astronomy of the Fertile Crescent and the Greeks with whom the Egyptians interacted and may explain in part the dynamism of the West as compared to the relative comparative conservatism of the Far East with its stability of culture and long-lasting dynasties. In order to understand Chinese astronomy, at least in the years after 1800 BCE, it is useful to take some time to discuss the idea of the Mandate of Heaven. The idea dates back in time to the dim recesses of history, at least to the beginning of the Zhou dynasty and probably a good bit earlier than that. The idea of the mandate is that the right to rule the people of the Middle Kingdom, as the region of this claimant civilization, someday to be all of China, called itself, is conferred upon a person from the supernal Lord or Emperor of Heaven, known as the Shang. This rule is granted to one who is sufficiently pious in keeping the traditions, performing the sacred and necessary rites and rituals, and seeing to the well-being of the people. If a ruler was negligent in these duties, the mandate could be removed and assigned to another. It was a political system somewhere between divine right and consent of the governed that produced enormous stability and conservatism while also reining in, at least in most cases, the worst abuses of power. One of the most striking things about this idea is that it is heaven that grants the mandate. So what is heaven and the associated personage of Shang? In my research, I've come to recognize that this idea seems to evolve over time from an ordering god emperor, Shang to something of a disembodied personage, to the very essence of the sky and the sense of awe and wonder that it inspires, Tian. While it has a will, this will seems to be something without a lot of emotion that strives for order and balance in the energies of the natural world and the affairs of humanity. Eternal and unchanging, but able to flow through various cycles, the Shang is associated almost from the beginning with the circumpolar regions of the sky and the patterns of stars found there. What I hope to do is trace some of the aspects of the development of Chinese astronomy in concert with this idea to more fully show its relationship to all aspects of Chinese life. Our earliest evidence of astronomically concerned settlements in the Yellow River region date to around 2500 BCE in a city known as Taoxi in western Shanxi province, near the location where the Yellow River makes an abrupt turn to the north. Along with bronze bells, jade artifacts, and multicolored pottery, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of what are known as pounded earth foundations for structures long disappeared. These ancient buildings' purposes can occasionally be deduced from the shape of the foundations, and it is one such area that shows that there was a likely temple for solar observation that had been constructed based on horizon observations of the winter and summer solstices. To get a sense of the spirit terrace, as it has been called, think of being on a garden terrace of raised earth a few feet tall, standing kind of in a corner intersection of two low walls. Facing east of you is a series of columns about 10 or 12 feet tall with gaps between them. From where you stand, the gaps leave about the same visual space as your forefinger held at arm's length. The columns are arranged in an arc, with the two leftmost sticking about 3 or 4 feet out further away from you than the other 12 do. They range from the southeast on your right to the northeast on your left. If you were to stand in the center of the arc, with all but the two leftmost columns the same distance from you, you'd be almost in the corner, and on the winter solstice, you'd be able to watch the sun rise directly between the second and third columns to your right. 6 months later, standing in the same place, the sun would rise between the last two outset columns on your left. While a bit ad hoc, with the outset columns likely being added after it was realized that the original terrace wouldn't have a big enough arc to observe the entire range of sunrises, it is very clear that this structure was constructed in order to facilitate the observations necessary to establish the length of the solar year. Similar types of structures are found in other places and may date actually to even earlier. The reason it's important to establish this archaeological waypoint is because shortly after it, there's a big shift in the orientation of astronomy in the region. The dates of the Taoxi as a significant habitation, perhaps even as a city, overlap with a later and even more famous site known as Erlitou, and it is here that we see for the first time the orientation of human markers and monuments, things like temples, tombs, graves, etc., not in relation to the sun's rising and setting positions on the horizon, but rather with the circumpolar regions of the sky. This change from what would have been an ecliptically based system of observation to a polar equatorial system is tremendously consequential, as it will remain in place for the rest of the history of China. And while it will not completely displace the system based on the motions of the sun and the moon, as these are profoundly important to agricultural tasks, it will become what the political and religious systems of China will be based on for thousands of years. In other words, this may be the archaeological quote-unquote moment where the early Bronze Age cultures of the Yellow River Valley begin to conceive of their cosmology as being one of permanence instead of cyclicality. One other semi-historical note is in order here. The early Tao culture, centered on the archaeological site of a town known by the same name, is associated by some anthropologists with the semi-mythical Shang dynasty, traditionally the first dynasty of China. Whether or not this is true, it does seem that the culture, among the first to produce bronze in substantial quantities, was the first also to have oriented its culture towards the circumpolar region of the sky to the north. Something rather surprising given the lack of a pole star at the time, a point to which we will return later in the podcast. It may also be the place that the mandate of heaven originated with a specific astronomical occurrence. In a later record of the founding of the dynasty, its first king, Yu the Great, is said to have been tasked by the supernal lord, Shang with bringing 3 warring tribes to heel and thus establishing peace by the Yellow River. Yu, already known for his taming of the river's tendency to flood, carried out the task and was awarded what is called the Dark Scepter, a symbol of rule fashioned from jade. This scepter, given in a place called the Dark Palace, was recognition of Yu's right to rule, bestowed by Shang based on his having established both natural and political order. What's interesting is that this quote-unquote Dark Palace is an actual place in the sky designated on Chinese astronomical maps, rather than something metaphorical, or at least just metaphorical. It refers to the winter or watery quadrant of the heavens that is associated with the Great Square of Pegasus for those of us who live in the West, but is known also as the Temple of Heaven, or Ding to the Chinese. Through the use of astronomical software such as Starry Night or the free Stellarium package, it is possible to run the clock backwards, so to speak, to the time when these events are said to have taken place. When this is done, a very rare thing is found to have happened near the year of the founding of the Shang dynasty. In 1953 BCE, near the square that makes up the body of the constellation of Pegasus, or as the Chinese have called it, like I said, the Temple of Heaven, all 5 planets that would have been visible to ancient astronomers of the time would have risen in the pre-dawn sky within an area smaller than 3 fingers held up together from knuckle to tip at arm's length. In other words, it would be a region smaller than 3 or 4 degrees across. Mercury and Mars would have been so close together that they would have been virtually indistinguishable and would have formed a triple star with Venus, while Jupiter and Saturn would have just been a little bit off of those. As Pan Kinnear puts it, it is, quote, the most spectacular planetary massing in human history, unquote. I have to tell you, after having recreated this conjunction using the Stellarium software, and having spent more than just a few chilly nights and mornings looking at planetary conjunctions over my career, I can assure the listener that what would have been visible just above the southeastern horizon beginning at the end of January of that year would have been absolutely spectacular. For the early-to-rise farmer, each morning would have brought the planets closer and closer together until the described conjunction was seen. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that for a culture used to watching the night sky to determine the proper time to begin preparing the fields for planting, this would have been an unprecedented omen, never before seen in human memory. So profound an event was this occurrence that it would make it into cultural lore and be recorded 1,000 years later in the annals of the time by the scribes and historians of the Zhou dynasty. Even more interesting is that the periods generally associated with the dynastic changes from the Shang to the Shang dynasty, and then from the Shang to the Zhou dynasty, are marked by similar, though somewhat less spectacular planetary conjunctions. Turns out that at about every 500 years or so, this sort of a grouping of planets happens, and for the Chinese, such a celestial event portended that the supernal Lord sought dynastic change to restore balance. It seems clear that when the idea of the mandate of heaven is fully enunciated near the beginning of the Zhou dynasty as a way of legitimizing their seizure of power from the Shang, they made the argument that heaven would signal the removal of its favor from a corrupt dynasty through not only natural disasters such as earthquakes, but also through celestial omens, none more significant than the gathering of the wandering planets near astronomically significant regions of the sky as a sign of the change in political order so as to restore the proper balance of the Middle Kingdom. Of course, that such a grouping took place in the same year that the Zhou first sought to overthrow the Shang dynasty in 1059 BCE was a sign of the righteousness of their cause. One question that arises in relation to this transition from solar-based astronomy to circumpolar-based astronomy is how the astronomers of the age would have kept track of the agricultural seasons. The answer to this lies in the hexagram symbols from the I Ching, representing the yang and the yin and their relation to China's most recognizable mythological figure, the Long. A hexagram symbol is the series of 6 horizontal lines stacked one on top of the other. The lines can either be drawn broken or unbroken in the middle, and they give rise to 64 separate combinations, all of which have various meanings in terms of discussing various changes. Each line represents a stanza from a poetic explanation of the meaning of the symbol. The hexagram of the 6 unbroken lines represents the full expression of heavenly yang energy, while 6 broken lines represents the earthly and receptive yin energy. In the I Ching, the stanzas associated with the yang hexagram include the top one being hidden dragon, do no work, then dragon appearing in the fields. There's a third line that's unrelated to our discussion. 4th, perhaps bounding in the void. 5th, soaring dragon in the sky. 6th, recalcitrant dragon, there is regret. And about the lines collectively, quote, a flock of dragons with no head, auspicious, unquote. As can be seen, there's a powerful association of this symbol with the dragon, and so let's take a moment to talk about the dragon and its astronomical counterpart, the Cerulean dragon. Unlike in European mythology, where the dragon is a symbol of terror and aggression and is seen as a malevolent force, the dragon, also known as the Long, is best characterized in Chinese culture in the words of John Hay. He writes, quote, the dragon's inseparable association with the flux of substance, seen in water and mist, its emergence from this flux, and inevitable disappearance back into it, embodied in the transformational processes of actualization itself. The transformations of the dragon, along the axes and across the categories of existence, were inherent in its nature. Unquote. Accordingly, it is a sign of the favor of heaven, and a gift given to rulers who displayed virtue, practiced justice, and embodied reverence towards the ancient spirits. Here, though, the stanzas of the hexagram teach us the way in which ancient astronomers and farmers would have remembered when to plant and when to harvest. In Chinese astronomy, there is a constellation known as the Cerulean Dragon. This grouping of stars encompasses the western constellations of the zodiac from Libra on the western edge to Scorpius on the eastern, with the bright red star Antares serving as the heart of the dragon, just as it does in the western Scorpion. Unlike the custom in the West, Chinese astronomers divided the sky into 28 lunar lodges that were often grouped up to make larger constellations. In the dragon, these lodges include horns with the bright star of Virgo, Spica, neck, heart with the aforementioned Antares, and tail, which encompasses the tail of the scorpion in Western astronomy. Early in the spring, the bright star of Virgo, and hence the horns of the dragon, would appear just above the eastern horizon following sunset. Now, how did you find this star? Well, the best way to do it is by following the curve of the handle of the Big Dipper, first to a bright star that we call Arcturus, and then to this bright star known as Spica in the west. Now, this relates to the second stanza in that hexagram, quote, "Dragon appears in the fields," unquote. And when it was accompanied by the full moon, frequently displayed in depictions of the dragon as a pearl being chased, that was the cue to begin preparing the fields for planting. The pre-dawn rising of this star, along with the moon's arrival in the celestial temple, is what marks the arrival of the new year on the Chinese calendar. Throughout the summer, the dragon, eventually spanning a full 75 degrees across the southern sky, would appear more fully after sunset. On the summer solstice, the dragon would be horizontal, parallel to the horizon, and thus would completely mimic the stanzas in the hexagram. Later, when the horns and neck disappeared below the horizon, it would be time to harvest and the world would begin to fade towards rest. Again, these ideas are found in the lines or stanzas of the hexagram description from the I Ching. In the wisdom document, Discourses of the States, there is a long passage delineating a series of activities, each appropriate to the time of the year, based on the position of the dragon in the night sky, either at sunset for the spring through fall period or at sunrise for the fall through springtime. As such, we can see that in the China of 3,500 years ago, time could have been kept without having to build the monumental structures to observe the solstices and equinoxes found both in many other cultures and at earlier Chinese sites. It is at this point that we need to do some additional astronomy that is a bit esoteric, but very important both here and in the Chinese astronomical systems of the time period between 2200 BCE and 100 CE. While Polaris marks the celestial North Pole in our time, that's not always been the case. For reasons we'll discuss a ways down the road, the moon's influence on the Earth causes the Earth to wobble in its orbit around the sun, a bit like a top that isn't completely straight up or down. This means that the place that the Earth's North Pole, the axis around which it rotates, points to in the sky, changes over time. This precession, as it is called now, takes 26,000 years to happen, and while this is a very long time, far longer than recorded history, it's not so long that changes won't be noticed by long-lasting cultures, and orientations wouldn't have been skewed because of its motion. A better way to see this is that the position of the pole in the night sky will move by about 1 degree every 72 years. This not only affects the poles, by the way, but also the rising and setting positions and times of the sun at the two solstices. While 72 years would have been about twice the lifetime of a typical farmer of the day, oral tradition would have been strong enough that successive generations would have noted the change. Now, it should be said that the ancient Chinese wouldn't have had any sort of explanation of why this kind of change took place. Their earliest cosmology said that creation was made of two pieces of a turtle shell, with the sky being the top half and the earth being the bottom, an idea strengthened and supported by the pattern on the bottom of the shell that superficially resembled the dividing of the region by the 6 rivers. While the Earth's spherical nature would be discovered during the imperial period, that would be more than 2,000 years after the time we're discussing. And even in that time, there's no indication that Chinese astronomers had any more idea that the Earth turned than their Western or Near Eastern contemporaries. As we discussed in the episode on Egypt, at the time of the first dynasty of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, circa 3200 BCE, the celestial North Pole was marked fairly closely by the star Thuban, the brightest star in what is now known as the constellation of Draco. Over the course of the next 1,000 or so years, however, that would have changed to where the celestial pole would not have been marked by a star. While it still would have been recognizable, especially to those cultures who would have at one time marked the pole with a star, that the sky turned around a single unmoving point, it wouldn't have been possible to simply sight a star, as we do with Polaris now, to find the pole. For the Chinese, it seems that the shift between the ecliptically focused Longshan culture of Taosi and the circumpolarly oriented early Tao culture took place right at around 1800 BCE, right smack dab in the middle of the time when there wouldn't have been a star even close to the celestial North Pole. So, if the culture can't find the pole just by looking for a particular star, the way we can today, or the most ancient of Egyptian cultures did, how did they do it? To understand this, it is necessary to take a brief but interesting detour into anthropology. When we talk about the dynasties of China, it is usually said that the first dynasty, the Shang, is quasi-historical, with what is known about it being attributed to artifacts and cities rather than written records. Like many of the early civilizations on the edge of historicity, many of the figures that belong to the oral tradition of the culture are more mythological than historical. Think Romulus and all the stories attributed to him. For the Shang, the stories of Yu the Great and his descendants are recorded in later annals, but we have little in the way of a written record from the time to use to corroborate the claims made about their lives. In Chinese history, the first dynasty that we have a written record of is actually the second dynasty, the Shang. While we discussed a few of their accomplishments earlier in the podcast, they are also the first people of the Yellow River Valley that we have written records from in the form of what are known as oracle bones. These are the shells of turtles, or the scapulae of oxen, that have been used in the practice of what is known as pyromantic divination, i.e., the application of heat to the bones until thermal expansion causes them to crack, and then reading the resulting fracture pattern to determine a prophecy of future events. What makes these so helpful is that the diviners would inscribe on the bones the question they wanted to know the answer to, the prophecy read from the cracks created in the bones, and then the outcome of the event to compare with the prophecy, which is, by the way, something rather remarkable in the practice of divination, even today. These artifacts are of tremendous use in understanding Shang culture, as well as that of the latter Zhou dynasty, and it is from them that we begin to get our first solid understanding of the development of both writing and astronomy in Chinese culture. Now, before I go too much further, let me offer a quote from Merlin Donald. He writes, quote, "The earliest evidence of an elementary form of theory formation is found in ancient astronomy. Astronomical knowledge, like writing, was a powerful device of social control. The measurement of time in terms of astronomical cycles was probably the ultimate controlling activity in early agricultural societies, setting dates for planting, harvesting, storage, and distribution of grain for religious observations, as well as a number of other cyclical social functions. Quite early in the history of visiographic symbolism, analog devices were invented that served both a measurement and predictive function in representing time. These devices eventually allowed humans to track celestial events, construct accurate calendars, and keep time on a daily basis." He continues, "The idea that writing produced scientific and technological development probably reverses the real order of things. It is just as likely that the invention of writing and other notational devices was driven by the conceptual needs of emerging theoretic culture. Writing, and graphic symbolism in general, arrived on the scene long after a number of major conceptual developments had already taken place. The historical order is important. If all theoretic development had followed writing, and especially if it had followed the invention of an alphabet, an argument could be made that it somehow depended on the latter. A long list of technological and proto-scientific inventions preceded writing." Unquote. The point of this is to suggest that much of Chinese writing evolved out of a need to document the observational knowledge being transmitted through oral tradition astronomically. there are clear indications that the graphical system or lettering or characters of the stem and branch system upon which the Chinese calendar is based is likely taken from the need to preserve an early rhyme that was most likely used to remember how to count days astronomically. For those interested in learning more about this, I recommend Pan Kinnear's discussion, as the foray into linguistic theory would take us too far afield of our present topic. In the case of finding the celestial pole, we see a similar conjunction in the development of astronomical thought and writing. As we've mentioned, the realm of the pole was thought to be the dwelling place of Shang, the supernal lord. In Chinese writing, he has his own character, which looks like an X through which a T has been drawn, with the top of the T connecting the top of the X. At the junction of the X and the T, right there in the middle, a box is often drawn as a representation of a temple. The origin of this character, found on many oracle bones of the Shang and Zhou dynasties, presented a puzzle for linguists and ethnographers. Pan Kinnear suggests a solution to the problem that involves the stars at the end of the Little Dipper being connected by imaginary crossing lines to the stars in the handle of the Big Dipper, which would have been across the sky from the celestial North Pole. These imaginary lines would have formed an X. The crossing point of the X would have marked the celestial North Pole with a fairly high level of accuracy. If a plumb bob was then held and allowed to fall from the middle of either end of the X through the point where the lines crossed, it would mark due north on the horizon. This arrangement looks nearly identical to the graphical symbol for Shangdi and could be thought of as representing bringing down the mandate of heaven. Evidence in support of this idea of star patterns leading to graphical symbols can be found in the Chinese character for dragon, which strongly resembles the shape of the Cerulean dragon constellation we discussed earlier, and the character for dipper or ladle, which, as you might imagine, looks a lot like the Big Dipper. We have, in later accounts by Chinese scholars, a description of the method very similar to the one Pan Kinnear describes using a gnomon and a plumb bob. Additionally, there are similar examples of this technique found in Egyptian records from roughly the same time that were associated with the stretching the cord ceremony we discussed in the previous episode. Also, there are pictures of this describing equipment used by Roman surveyors to do the same sorts of things. For early cultures in which this method may not have worked due to the lack of alignment of the imaginary crossing lines that would have worked only for the period around 1500 BCE, there is one additional method one can use to determine north from the night sky. It turns out that when the square of the constellation of Pegasus, what we called earlier the Ding, or Temple of Heaven, is due south on the meridian, the two sides of the square, which isn't, by the way, quite square, point up to the celestial North Pole within a degree of accuracy. Moreover, the eastern side of the square is accurate within 15 minutes of arc. The difficulty with this method, however, is that it is impossible to sight both south on the celestial temple and north on the pole at the same time. What that means then is what you're really determining as south and figuring north out from that. Additionally, at that time, the Ding was only due south at dusk during the month of October, meaning that the setting of direction for buildings, temples, and graveyards, those kinds of things, could only take place during that month, something recorded in the spring and autumn annuals. As a final topic of discussion for our survey of ancient Egyptian astronomy, it wasn't just that heaven and its mandate were brought down to earth. It was possible, with the guidance of a shaman, to ascend to the place of the supernal Lord and through the journey return changed and enlightened. While a record of this practice date to the Tang dynasty, it is clear that the ceremonies and rituals associated with it date back to a time thousands of years earlier. The practice of shamanism is, in part, based on the idea that greater enlightenment can be achieved through a spiritual journey of some kind. Very often, The participation in the rituals associated with this involve a process of transcendence, participation in a cosmic cycle, and then rebirth. However, as this journey is fraught with any number of perils, it is useful to have an experienced guide who has walked the path before the supplicant. This shaman was someone wise and well-versed in the ways of spiritual or religious practices shared by the culture. In the case of ancient Chinese spirituality, which blended shamanism with ancestor worship, it is thought that the spirit of one's father departed to reside with the supernal Lord in the northern regions of the sky, which, as was the case with the Egyptians, was thought to be the place of immortality. In order to commune with the spirits of one's ancestors, it was necessary to ascend to the region on a spirit journey. As is often the case, this journey was aided through the use of hallucinogenic medicinal herbs, usually datura, and the ritual guidance of a shaman who was able to guide the person through the potentially harrowing journey to the realm of the immortal. One way to think of this, a topic touched on in Ron Levy's CM podcast episodes on LSD, is the idea of having someone around to supervise the taking of the drug. In the 60s and early 70s, there are a number of cases of individuals who decided to quote-unquote drop acid, as it was called, but who did so in unsupervised environments and sometimes in conjunction with other substances. The resulting bad trips were psychologically scarring and have done much to create the tremendously negative connotation associated with the substance. In shamanistic cultures, very specific rituals and practices were put into place to negotiate and mediate this experience. Those overseeing the spiritual journey are people who have undergone the journey on multiple occasions and thus are said to have the experience to help the person through the practice and reach communion with the spiritual or make the journey unharmed. A big part of the Chinese practice of this was known as climbing the pole. In this, the shaman, and in some cases, the supplicant, would perform a ritual dance with choreographed steps, something known as pacing the void. These steps would transport the person from the ground-based existence into the realm of heaven. While there are a number of variants of this dance, the most common was called the Dance of Yu, after the first king of the Shang dynasty, and involved a series of steps that emulated climbing the handle of the Big Dipper up into its bowl. Some anthropologists have suggested that this dance was derived from Neolithic dances that emulated the movements of a bear, which, in its life cycle, embodies power and strength in life, and then death and resurrection through hibernation. From a manuscript of the Tang dynasty we have, quote, "When you wish to tread the mainstays, first hold your breath, and turning left outside the 7 stars, travel the 3 circuits above the Dipper's cloud and white souls. Only then may you ascend to the solar luminosity." Unquote. With this passage is a diagram showing the specific steps of the dance, much like the old figures demonstrating various dance steps from the 1950s. Another path for ascension was that of sailing or paddling the celestial river, also known as the Milky Way. Crossing the ecliptic from the horizon towards the northern part of the sky, the Milky Way plays a large role in the astronomy and cosmology of ancient China. The constellation of Corona Australis is known in Chinese astronomy as the celestial turtle, and its location just south of the ecliptic next to the Milky Way means that it was thought to be responsible for ferrying the sun, moon, and planets across the celestial river. As such, it becomes strongly associated with the process of assisting the transport of the spirit into the eternal realm, whether that be on a spirit journey or at the end of physical life. As the soul travels up the celestial river, thought to be a mirror of the terrestrial Yellow River, there is an attendant ascension into the realm of the spirit and to the place of the supernal Lord. As the idea of Shangdi slowly transforms into the more conceptual idea of Tian, or personified sky heaven in later dynasties, the Milky Way will continue to play an important role. It is here that I will bring this episode to a close. While there's still a great deal to cover in the area of astronomy in the middle and later dynasties of China, we've reached to a point where doing so would create something more akin to an audiobook than a podcast episode. My hope is that when I get to the point of doing some episodes on medieval astronomy, we can return to China to survey astronomical practices found in the period of the imperial dynasties from the Han onward. There is still much to say about the calendar systems used, the return of solar astronomy, and the practices of the emperors, such as the one described at the beginning of this episode, that were supposed to ensure that the ruler retained the mandate of heaven. Once again, thanks for listening, and I hope you found this episode as interesting and informative as I found the research that went into it. I have to say that I've learned a ton doing these explorations into the astronomical practices of various cultures. One of the hardest things about doing the research, however, is trying to learn enough about the history, culture, and language to place the astronomy in a meaningful context. As I do the research, I feel like I'm cramming way too much information into my head and that my brain just might pop if I'm not careful. Hopefully, the process hasn't resulted in too jumbled a mess. If you want more information on what's been discussed, I would again suggest you look at Chris Stewart's History of China podcast and E.C. Krupp's Echoes of Ancient Skies. For those with more familiarity with Chinese history and culture, Pan Kinnear's book is definitely worth the time and effort. Speaking of taking a little time, if you can, stop in on whatever service you use to listen to the podcast and leave us a review. It's a huge help in getting the word out. Also, for those who've stopped by to check us out on the recommendation of the folks over at the CM podcast, welcome. It's really great to have you with us. Rand and his team over there are doing great work. If you like what you're hearing, please feel free to invite some more folks to join us. We always have room for another curious mind here at the Odyssey. Next week, I think what we're going to do is we're going to jump back into the main narrative and we're going to take a look at the planets and what we know about them. It's really an interesting part of the story, and it's going to be very, very important later on. So until next week, full sails on your journey.